I want to spend a couple of minutes just before we even introduce ourselves formally, just giving you a little bit of context about what we're talking about, what we're going to discuss today, give you the sort of meta view of things. I guess it was a couple of weeks ago, Sarah and I got together to discuss what we wanted to present today, and we agreed that we wanted to talk about a program that we've been involved in, each of us has been involved in over the last couple of years, that we call Portage. We'll explain what that is in a minute. In the course of that discussion, we started to dig into the data that we have collected over the years for this program, and we kind of came to the simultaneous realization about the inadequacy of that data to describe the experience that students were having in this program, and even more, the sort of banality of that kind of pre and post numerical data. And so that led to an interesting discussion, a meandering discussion, as is often the case with Sarah and I, and led to a number of questions that we both had about assessment in general, and this kind of mutual disdain is a too strong a word, but a mutual kind of discontent with certain assessment practices. And so we talked more and more about that and decided that rather than talk about Portage in particular, we would actually zero in on what it was we were trying to get at in our conversation, which was this kind of discomfort with assessment practice in general, and we decided that we would just talk about that. Now, I just want to be clear right off the bat that this is not a anti-assessment tirade. As educators, we understand that well-conceived, thoughtful approaches to evaluating learning experiences with the goal of improving and making those experiences more meaningful is a worthwhile thing to do. So let's just put that aside for a second, because we also think that this assessment culture that has embedded itself so deeply into the marrow of higher education is a thing worthy of scrutiny and critique and questioning. And so we're here just to simply add our voice, our humble voice, to the chorus, the muted chorus, I would say, of people who are critiquing this assessment culture. We're going to do that on two fronts. One is we're going to, in a cursory way, investigate or situate assessment culture in a sort of political or ideological or historical context in a very sort of brief way, just to see who is best served by this assessment culture. And secondly, we're going to raise some questions about that most preferred version of assessment practice that we are all very familiar with, which is the learning outcomes approach to assessment. And we're going to do all of that by using this Portage program as a kind of case study, as an example of a program that is ill-fitting for that kind of learning outcomes approach to assessment. So all of that leads to our formal introduction. So my name is John Hanna. I am the Assistant Director here of Student Learning Support at Ryerson University in Toronto. And Student Learning Support is just the name that we give to our version of academic support programs. This is a full suite of academic support located in one place on our campus.
And my name is Sarah Cloak, and my role here is as a student accommodation facilitator with academic accommodation support. And the largest part of my role is working with students with a range of diagnoses and supporting them academically through accommodations. And usually this will look like a lot of one-on-one appointments, speaking to the professor and that sort of thing. But this past summer, my role changed a bit and expanded to be working on this portage program. And with that, a lot of the, like John mentioned, a lot of the conversations that him and I have back and forth actually revolve around a lot of questions that we have. And so in terms of this culture of assessment and measuring these outcomes for students, with the pressure to assess, does that ever constrain the creativity or the emergence of results for students? And does that in turn almost influence the student feedback or what they're going to report to us based on what we're asking? And finally, the biggie, at least for me, was in terms of, does the value of student affairs programming, such as this portage program, are the results of that ever self-evident? And what we mean by that is sometimes with our gut feelings at the end of these programs, or without even this explicit reasoning, our kind of intuition still felt rational and it still felt justified, even if we didn't have these numbers to prove it. And the interesting part of all of this was that John and I both ran the portage program on separate years, and we used very similar measures and arguably very similar results from these assessments. But if you were to ask John and I, the experiences of what we would report back were very different, and those couldn't really be captured in these standardized assessments that we were using.
So these are just 3 examples of questions. There are a number of other ones that came up in our conversations that may work their way into our conversation today. So get comfortable, have a cup of coffee, and come along to our meandering thoughts. Oh, a special hello to the folks on the 5th floor. I know you're listening.
So just a bit of background about portage and how we're going to use that as an example with this culture of assessment piece. So portage is a government-funded program through the Ministry of Ontario, and it works in relation or almost consecutively to a transition program we run at Ryerson University called SHIFT. And it's a program for incoming first-year students to help support them to transition in to first year. And it's usually for students that are identifying as someone with a diagnosis, and that they will then be registering with academic accommodation support as well. And so SHIFT is what happens before portage, and it's a week-long program that works on various goals and strategies and skills for students, not necessarily only for students with diagnoses, but that's typically the population of students that we see. Now, with a program like SHIFT, last year there was about 25 registered students. But comparatively, with the program of portage, it is smaller scale. And so this past year there were, I think, 7 or 8 registered students. And you can see in the picture we had 2 portage guides and then 2 staff as well. And so with that, it's a 3-day canoe trip out into Algonquin Park, in that we are taking in everything, we are bringing out everything with us. The students are entirely responsible for setting up their own tents, for helping to cook food, for navigating portage routes, and the entire experience is pretty powerful, especially for those students that maybe have never even paddled before, maybe never even camped before, or knew what a word like portage meant prior to the experience. And with that, it comes with a lot of background research about the environmental elements and the impact that being, in the wilderness could have.
So I can speak just briefly a little bit more about that, because it's one of the questions that comes up that came up for us for sure in this, and I think it comes up for all of us at times, the question of when is it finally good enough to just rely on the previous supportive research to engage in a program without having to collect a lot of data. I know that sounds like an anti-assessment approach, but really the research that has gone on about the value across various dimensions of outdoor programming like this is robust and deep and ubiquitous, and over and over again in the literature since the founding of Outward Bound for sure. There is study after study after study that reveals in some way that there is value to these programs. And so the question just comes up about when it becomes enough to use that body of research to support what you're doing and relieving yourself of any sort of burden or meaningless burden of collecting further data that might not tell you anything new.
And as well with that, one of the factors that John and I talked a lot about portage and how different our experiences were is with a situation where you're taking a group of students that didn't know each other prior into a provincial park, portaging for 3 days. There are a number of unpredictable variables that can have impacts on the outcome, and that can, not necessarily can be measured, much like something like the weather. And John and I talked about how on my portage trip, it rained pretty heavily for the one full day that we had out on the water. And even the age of the staff that were there, or even that with a program like Portage that is so centered on relationship building and rapport building, and even not being able to measure the sort of students that came to this. So Portage can't really capture these unpredictable variables in a way that could even be measured.
So I should say also that if we're not going to talk anymore in much detail about the Portage program specifically, but if anybody is ever interested to know more about that, you can certainly fire us off an email. We're happy to talk about it all day long. So now that you have a kind of a grounding where we're coming from, you know something about our challenges with assessments with a specific set of programs. I want to just leave this shot up on the screen for a few minutes. I'm not going to make direct reference to it right away. I want the beauty and elegance of this to just wash over you for a minute while I talk about this political dimension to the assessment culture and sort of place things in a bit of a historical context. So there is a point of view that suggests that this rise in assessment culture coincides with a shift in higher education from serving the public good to serving the needs of the marketplace. So, I don't know, maybe post-World War, there was a kind of hysteria about quality in education, in higher education, that sprang probably from sort of paranoia about nations falling behind. And this is a very North American sort of conception, but I'm sure it's true everywhere else. And so in those sort of shrill calls for better quality of education to be more globally competitive, that began this shift and this sort of pernicious takeover of higher education from global market forces. So there is now a kind of neoliberal agenda, an ideology, a market-driven ideology that has taken a very firm grip on higher education and views learning as a commodity and students as human capital to be sold in the marketplace. And so that market-driven kind of ideology informs almost everything that we do now, and it certainly demands a kind of a certain kind a certain brand of assessment. And so if you take that ideology as a thing that is true, and you combine that with another dimension that I think is interesting, and I just thought of this on my way to work this morning, in fact, and I'm stealing here from Gardner Campbell, who is describing Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So in that book, Daniel Kahneman describes two systems of human thinking. There's system one, and there's system two. System one is that part of ourself that is involved in rapid processing of information to make a very, very quick decision about something. And so that's very useful. It allows us to cross the street and, without getting hit by a car, recognize our office when we get to work, etc. Very useful thing to have. And then system two is that part of ourself that is involved in more deliberative, deeper, slow reflection that takes time. And that's also a very useful thing. So in this sort of corporate, market-driven ideology that has gripped higher education, there has become a decided and overwhelming preference for system one kinds of thinking. So the sort of speedy, rapid response, efficiency, productivity, quick responses to shallow questions, as opposed to slow responses to deep questions. And so if you take these two things, and both of them are arguable, no doubt, but if you take these two things, a sort of political ideology that favors the marketplace, and a thinking system that favors quick processing, the marriage of those two things produce this perfect offspring, which is what you see on the screen in front of you, which is this assessment loop, or this assessment process that we're all quite familiar with. And this is the preferred approach to assessment based on prescribed learning outcomes. Okay, we're all familiar with that. It's a kind of an orthodoxy that is expressed over and over and over again in the literature. If you look if you look through the assessment literature, there's very, very little about critique of assessment itself. There's a lot about how to do assessment, technique and methodology, and most often it comes back to this kind of learning outcomes approach. I'm just going to read you a very short quote from an article published in 2008 in the NASPA Journal, which is a journal for student affairs administrators. This is an article by Adam Green, Elizabeth Jones, and Susan Alloy called An Exploration of High-Quality Student Affairs Learning Outcomes Assessment Practices. They say, and I quote, "For assessment to result in improvements to student learning, these key elements must be in place." So they're referring to the elements that you see on the screen. And that kind of orthodoxy, like I said, is expressed over and over and over again, and it comes from a kind of rationalist approach to knowledge building. And that rationalist approach, sort of Newtonian reductionist kind of approach to knowledge generation, is probably the kind of approach that is most informs what we do in education. And it's not an inevitable approach. I'll read you from Brent Davis, the sort of background to that approach. He says, "Following the new model, the teacher and curriculum planner first determined the desired outcomes, then identified the foundations that would enable the eventual attainment of those outcomes, and finally laid out a sequence of incremental steps that led from start to end. The results were lessons and programs of study that, like prevailing beliefs about knowledge, were assumed to be independent of time and place and hence suitable for everyone, everywhere." So that's a kind of philosophical idea that informs a lot of what we see in education in general. Things like curriculum, things like standardized tests, things like assessment practices, learning outcomes, Bloom's taxonomy, all of these constructs arise out of that philosophical position that sees learning as inherently measurable and outcomes as discrete and relevant to all people in all time. So these are things that we think are open to scrutiny, for sure, and in certain cases, like our experience with Portage, is not only inadequate to capture the experiences of learners, it actually hinders what is possible when we design and implement those programs.
So I think this is such a great visual of what John was summarizing there. So this is part of the feedback form that we administered at the end of Shift and Portage. And just the visual of the student not being allowed enough space to write what he truly felt about the program and his own experience with it. It might be difficult to read, but it's like, I enjoy this so much because the student has so much more to say than what we've given him the opportunity to express with different Likert scales or measures or that sorts of things. And the idea also being that we clearly weren't even addressing the things that he really wanted to passionately talk about and expand on. And so what I struggle with is how can this sort of rich data that the student is giving forth to us fit into the loop that was on the prior slide, and it just doesn't fit so nicely into it. Which goes really greatly, or works great with the next visual here, of the idea that sometimes we feel like with these assessments, it is this square peg trying to just be pounded into the circle hole.
So, I mean, I'm sure we've all felt that. I'm sure we've all felt a pressure to evaluate or to assess based not always entirely on improving the learning experience, although we certainly all do that, for sure. But we are all aware of a kind of overt or subtle pressure to numerically assess some of the programs that we are involved in, because in that sort of market-driven neoliberal world that I described, there is an overwhelming preference for counting and accountability. We want to be able to count. Numbers are what are rational. Anything else is suspect because it's open to wild flights of speculation or interpretation, and the world is afraid of that now. And so there's a decided pressure to conduct numerical assessments. I have to say that we happen to work at a place in Ryerson University that is very, very open and innovative and tolerant of some risk, and it is a place that has allowed us to do this Portage program at some risk, and there is some chaos involved in it. There is something that is very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to quantify with numbers. And so I say all that as a preface to what I also feel is this pressure to enumerate the program in some way, and that I felt that pressure right from the get-go. And we've all probably felt that pressure when we pitch an idea to somebody, and often the first question is, how will you measure that? And that's a fair question, but I think that where this becomes problematic is when the pressure to enumerate something quantitatively gets in the way of what we are able to do. And this preference for numbers imposes itself onto all our assessment practices. It inevitably will influence the design and the implementation of that program. And so we are always looking to find ways to have countable moments in the enterprise. And we also, this preference for numbers must also influence the end experience of the students. This is what Sarah's been talking about, who now evaluate their experience somehow through the strict prism of our assessment scheme. And there are so it's inadequate at best, but it's also it's hindering at worst.
And so to relate back to the experience of Portage, so again, these were students that had various diagnoses, mental health concerns, learning disabilities, and the irony being that part of my role is supporting the student in implementing various test and exam accommodations for them. And here we were administering this standard form to all of them without considering these unique needs of the students with various possibilities like alternative formatting, or even how we're distributing this. Is this meaningful for the student if the environment that they're being asked to complete these assessments in a classroom or in transition to another part of the program? And is it also explicit to what the intention is of this assessment and how their responses is going to be beneficial to us later? As well, talking about the previous visual with the student, writing outside the lines and on the back of the page, is that it doesn't necessarily always allow for that student's own narration or that student's individual experience. And when we're not asked to focus on this whole experience and instead on these smaller, more measurable factors, then the importance of this experience for the student, it almost seems to be diminished a bit for them, or almost seems to be a bit underestimated. And one of the things John and I have talked about is how rich that data is from that student narration and from those experiential variables, and that those may actually be more telling of the experience than scale or than something else that involves numerical data. Finally, one of the pieces with the portage and with SHIFT was that it's a transition program. And when you're measuring something unique like transition programming, it is difficult to measure the impact of it and isolate that program as a variable. So the impact may only be knowledgeable to the student in hindsight or after the fact or after a point that we've even measured it. So it can be, again, it can just be difficult to isolate, and that with a more narrative focus, we can help also, I think, empower the student a bit more to rely on the student to make sense of what they've experienced or the impact that these programs have had for them.
So I'm going to read you a quote that sort of captures nicely some of what we're talking about here. This is from Howard Dowdy. He's an academic at Seneca College here in Toronto. He writes, "Transforming education from dialogue into the personal acquisition of pre-digested, pre-packaged, and predetermined chunks of knowledge or individual competencies that can be externally observed, empirically measured, and judged by exclusively external criteria of validity, makes a mockery of the transformative and ultimately emancipatory purpose of liberal education." So that's, that's a lofty thing to say, and we are, that's a deeply political statement about the state of education, and I think it's worthwhile highlighting that, because that is part of what, part of the critique that is happening in the halls of academia is about that, and it's where we find ourselves. And in addition to the sort of inadequacies of the learning outcomes approach, this idea of assessing numerically or assessing at all has achieved a kind of moral correctness that is very difficult to argue against. It has reached this kind of unassailable state that we can no longer critique because it is gripped so hard. This is what I worry about. It's not that I think that evaluation or assessment is a bad thing. It's that it's reached that kind of reification that has, and this state of moral correctness, very difficult to argue against. Because I know when, and there are probably folks listening and who would be rightfully saying, as we speak, that what's wrong with doing numerical assessment plus qualitative? So a little mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative, you get a nice mixed approach. We all do that. And I'm not arguing necessarily against that. All I'm suggesting is that when there's an imposition of numerical approaches, which there almost always is, because it's something that is demanded, then it imposes itself on the learning experience itself. It somehow influences how we design it, how we implement it, and how students experience it, because they're looking at our boxes and our numbers. So, I mean, you can imagine other dimensions of life and study where this kind of critique, this opposition to a leveling out of and flattening out and tidying up of what is inevitably complex and messy part of human experience happens in all sorts of other walks of life. And this forcing feedback into boxes and privileging sort of linear, reductionist, mechanical approaches to things is critiqued in other areas. So one area that I'm reminded of comes from one of my heroes, Jane Jacobs, and she writes about cities and how cities are designed, and her opposition to the kind of planned, linear, Euclidean, geometric approach to the design of cities. And I think what she says about that is very apt in our approach to assessment and our constant desire to bring order and rationality to what is inevitably or often a complex, messy process. She writes, I think aptly here, there is a quality even meaner than outright ugliness or disorder, and this meaner quality is the dishonest mask of pretended order, achieved by ignoring or suppressing the real order that is struggling to exist. So I like that quote juxtaposed on this image because we can see a student who is struggling to express some sort of real order that is in him that we haven't given space for. And we have imposed the mask of a kind of pretended order over top of it and created a kind of experience or a prism through which he has that experience.
So with that, there almost comes the point of a what now or what next. And so as John and I were talking through this idea and saying, here's our views or here are our challenges with typically developed assessment, we thought about more so the idea of incorporating these assessments into the actual program for students and into part of that experience for them. And for something like Portage, the value of the reflective experience for that and the narration for the student to be able to write about their experience without the contrived ticking of boxes is valuable for them, and it's valuable for us in terms of measuring their experience, but also for them. And that, as I mentioned before, it really helps to support the student to make sense of that experience independently and on their own. And most of the time, with their experience, they can only do that through writing it out themselves. Added to that is the idea that this narrative piece can be quite therapeutic for them. It can help them understand what they've experienced more. And it is a really nice symbolic closure for them to be able to write about it, as opposed to, as John mentioned, us telling them what to write about. If this was an open-ended response for them, the data would still be rich. We would still be able to highlight those range of contextual factors which influence the outcomes, but it would also be beneficial to the student. And I think it would also be impactful for them, as the same way that the last 3 days we're canoeing through a provincial park, being able to process that on their own. It is important, if not more so, than a typical quantitative assessment.
So I can describe a little bit what it is that we actually did with some of the assessments in Portage, so you can have an idea of why we found this challenging and what we ultimately discovered. Is, at the beginning, because of that pressure and because, we also want to try to measure things, it has a kind of there was a draw to that. And so we early on designed, typical pre and post tests to measure the sorts of things that the research was saying outdoor programming would help students to develop. So things like increased confidence or increased preparedness, things that are, maybe difficult to measure objectively on a Likert scale, but we were interested to see whether there would be any movement from of students on along those scales. And so we designed typical pre and post things based on our prescribed learning outcomes that we made clear to the students as we went through the trip. So very early on, the early iterations of this trip were very, very different than the later iterations. So the early iterations were based on a very, very prescribed approach, based on what it is that we wanted to see students to develop as a result of doing the trip. And so we designed a kind of curriculum that would accompany the trip, and we designed assessments that we gave to the students on the bus on the way up, and then also again on the bus on the way down. They were short, they were fairly insubstantial, but they were very easy to compile into a set of compelling narratives that showed that students before the trip were not quite as confident as they were after the trip. And that, I think, affected the way the students actually, they ended up trying to give us what we thought we wanted to hear, essentially. And it kind of influenced the way they thought about the trip. And in subsequent years, because of the things that students told us maybe years later, were very interesting. And the kinds of realizations that they themselves had about the effect that trip had on their development as a student, or on their approach to school, or their connectedness with other people at the university, etc. These things that they told us far after anybody had ever asked us for assessment, sometimes years later, told us that we should start to let go of some of those learning outcomes that we were prescribing and just allow the students to actually tell us what they were getting from this trip. That in itself was valuable. And that I found it interesting how difficult it was to let go of that prescribed learning outcome approach and just to let the trip be what it is, and know that ultimately the way to measure it was going to be wide open. And the people who were asking me for assessments on this experience were going to be unsatisfied with the kinds of numbers, because I wasn't actually adding up any numbers. And so assessment as a kind of pedagogical practice is what we ended up employing. So ways to view the trip, ways to understand what the possibilities were on the trip without any preconceived notions, being open to emergent possibilities that we had never anticipated before. That was how we went about this from then on. And because it is an example of a kind of program that just resists numerical assessment.
And with the idea of the resisting of it as well, because this is a small-scale program, and because these experiences are so individualized for students, the idea of this narrative experience for them also can have the ability to empower these students and make them feel like their input is valuable, which I think is a really important part to highlight of the idea of including assessment in the programming, is that the students' experiences are valuable, not only to them, but also to us for the future. And so I think by doing that, by the student being able to write about it individually, I think that helps work towards that.
I'd add one more thought. We have a couple of minutes. Maybe there will be some interest in follow-up questions or something. We're happy to do that. But the final thought about one other potential impact of an imposed quantitative kind of Likert scale assessment is that students will then think that the value of the trip attached to those dimensions, so that at the end of the trip, if they feel like they have not acquired any more self-confidence, or they have not acquired any more preparedness for school, or they don't feel these things, then they will feel like the trip has been a failure to them, even though they might have experienced something quite different that we never anticipated. And if we don't give them a chance to talk about that or tell that story, then they will never be given the opportunity to know that that has inherent value. And so we may be, in some cases, setting students up for feeling like what they have just done is ultimately, has ultimately been a failure. And when we, as educators, define learning outcomes so strictly at the beginning and then find out that those learning outcomes were not achieved, then we ourselves will deem the enterprise a failure, even though something else equally important or more important may have happened. So I think that's probably it for us. Forgive us for being, this is meant, there certainly were no prescribed learning outcomes to this presentation. So we hope that this will just maybe prompt a little bit of thought as you are undergoing your next assessment to maybe make you think a little more deeply when you are trying to define your next set of learning outcomes based on action verbs. And ask yourself whether that's actually going to hinder or influence in some undue way the way you are designing your next program. Thanks everybody for listening. I don't know if we're the last presentation or not, but or if Michael's rejoined us. So I will say thank you and bid everybody farewell, unless anybody has anything they want to add. I see a question from Christina. We have two questions. How have you demonstrated the value of portage to stakeholders? Well, we just tell a good story, is what we do. I think that what like I said, early iterations did have some, fairly compelling quantitative sorts of results that showed on Likert scales that students moved in an upward way across various dimensions. That was enough to maybe convince people to keep it going. But for the most part, it has been student testimony. We've done a better job of allowing students to become part of the telling of the story, to become even return as mentors on future trips, which is a powerful experience for them. And so, we presented at some conferences. We certainly, weave into any narrative of this when we talk about portage, and we talk about it in a passionate way. We weave into that a lot of the research that is just that founds this. And like I said, at Ryerson, we have I think we have the luxury of being in a place that is not overly demanding when it comes to strict quantitative measures. There's room here for more a narrative approach to storytelling.
The next question Christina asked was, how can you imagine a balance between human testimony and quantitative assessment? And I think that question loops or connects back to the loop that we were referring to, where the first idea being that it was to create students and learning assessments and outcomes. And with the imagery of this square peg in a circle hole, is to start with the human testimonies. And I believe that you can extract themes from those, and that those can help navigate future quantitative assessments, but that there still needs to be the value placed on that narrative experience for the student, and make that the the starting, and that the quantitative can be extracted from that, but that the focus and that focal point should still be that human testimony.
I'm just going to add quickly to that you know, Sarah mentioned at the beginning that this Portage program is very small scale, so that it involves very small numbers of students. And so to impose sort of quantitative assessment at the beginning on a very small sample doesn't seem to make much sense to me. I think if we ran this program for the next, you know, several years, there may be a body of numerical data that might have some weight, but doing a numerical quantitative assessment on the experiences of 5 students doesn't seem to me to have much weight to it. So it's easy to combine both, but like I said, I think the quantitative gets in the way at worst. I think at best it's just meaningless, but at worst it actually gets in the way. But that's a very good question.